Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lead Organizing Skills for Grassroots Advocacy. I'm Lori Conrad. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the manager of Grassroots Advocacy here at NCJW. I'll be managing this training and running some of the back-end tech side today, and I'm really excited that everyone's able to join us. This is by far one of our most well-registered webinars, and so we're really excited to have everyone here with us. For folks who are joining us new, a little bit of background on LEAD. It's our monthly webinar series that focuses on a different organizing and advocacy skill every month. So check back often. Each month we're always talking about something new, and there's always tons of stuff to learn. In addition to that, you can find all of our previous recordings on our website, and we'll send out the link to that on with a follow-up email. The time stays the same every month, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time.
We need people to mute their phones. Everyone would mute their phones.
So we are going to try, and thanks for that. We're going to try talking some housekeeping for just a second. A few housekeeping notes. You should have all entered muted. If not, if you could go ahead and please mute yourself. And if you join by phone, please make sure you're on mute. It'll help make sure that we can stay on track and everyone is able to participate fully. If you have any questions or concerns or tech issues throughout the webinar, please feel free to reach out to either me, Ari Conrad, or Lindsay Morris. You can reach us, we're on the chat, which I'll talk about momentarily, or you can email us. If you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to either write them down and drop them into the chat, and we'll be able to get to them. There will be 2 points in the webinar that we'll be able to take a break and answer some questions. The first part will be a presentation, then we'll pause, answer some questions, and then we'll move on to a skills building piece, and at the end, hopefully we'll have some more time for questions as well. But I am going to ask that everyone hold your questions and drop them into the chat, and then we can go ahead and make sure that they get answered. Just a gentle reminder that we are recording this webinar, and we'll also upload it to our website after. We'll also send out a recording in the follow-up email to everyone who's registered. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our guest facilitator for this month, Sherry Brown. Sherry has had a lifetime commitment to doing social justice work. She founded the National Coalition Building Institute in 1984 with the goal of training activists and leaders all over the world in coalition building skills necessary to end the divisions that separate people. She has also built NCBI into one of the leading diversity training and grassroots leadership organizations with chapters or affiliate teams in over 40 communities worldwide. In addition to her work at NCBI, she is also adjunct faculty at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And from 2014 until now, she's been leading workshops at numerous college campuses and organizations following around how to respond to anti-Semitism. So we're really excited to have her, and I will kick it off to her.
Thanks, Ari. Am I on? I should go ahead. Okay. Well, I'm deeply honored to be doing this webinar for National Council of Jewish Women, an organization I deeply respect and feel connected to. So I am going to first present a number of basic coalition building principles to think about around dealing with issues around anti-Semitism while in coalition. Then, because the issue of anti-Semitism is often so confusing, I'm going to put out a number of reasons why I think it still confuses so many of us as well as our allies. And I will put forward 3 criteria for how we know something is anti-Semitism. I am going to introduce a piece that I call the hook, the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism. Then we'll stop for questions, and then I am going to teach a skill of what do you do when someone makes an anti-Semitic comment, remark, position, while trying to keep a good relationship. So with that, I will jump in, and I want to say a few key principles. So Lindsay, you can put the, start with the principles of coalition building, the next one. There we go, thank you. So there's 5 things I want to say overall. The first is that in my experience, many times as Jews, we tend to have two overall responses in the face of anti-Semitism in a coalition. One response, we don't say anything. Now that is shifting a bit since Charlottesville and Pittsburgh, but an overall response has historically been we don't say anything for a whole set of reasons. It's our friends, colleagues, coalition partners. We're not sure if it's anti-Semitic. We think other issues are more important. We think we will get attacked if we say something. For a whole set of reasons, we stay silent. The other response is we decide we have to leave. It is too egregious and we have to go. And I want to be clear that I am not saying under all circumstances should we never leave. My goal with this webinar is to hold out what would it mean to gain, and I want to say gain the muscle, to stay and take on the anti-Semitism. Because the truth is everyone in the coalition that we partner with is going to have oppressor material about many different groups. That there is not a man who doesn't have sexist conditioning. There is not a white person who hasn't gotten racist conditioning. There is not a heterosexual person that doesn't have homophobic conditioning. And there is not a Gentile that doesn't have anti-Semitic conditioning. And so part of our work being in coalition is to teach each other what causes each other pain, what are the raw spots, what is the information we need each other to understand. And if we don't stay, we're also not going to move forward the work on anti-Semitism. So I think it's key to always look at basically are the principles, practices of that coalition something we agree with? And if so, to at least consider staying and learning how to take on the anti-Semitism. So that's what I want to just say as an introduction around principles of coalition building. Lindsay, you can move to the slide about why is anti-Semitism so confusing, which is actually the next one after that. Okay, there we are. So I'm going to give some reasons I think that it's been so challenging, particularly in progressive movements. And I want to say that I am more speaking on this webinar to coalitions with other progressive organizations. I mean, it's a lot easier to tell that there's anti-Semitism when, we are told Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville, or Jews are mowed down and shot in Pittsburgh. There's not a confusion of is that anti-Semitism. But I want to look at some of the reasons that things still have stayed so confusing. And then I will share what I am saying are the 3 criteria. So the first reason is, the way I like to talk about it, is there are no grades of mistreatment when we think about anti-Semitism in the way that there have been around other isms. To give you an example, I was at a training program a number of years ago, and I thought something someone said was pretty anti-Semitic. I went to the organizer of the event, a major progressive known activist, and said, I think that was anti-Semitic. I will never forget. He didn't say to me, no, Sherry, it wasn't. He said, oh, Sherry, don't say that. And I never forgot that. I think, or at least I'd like to think, if I went to him and said, I think there was some sexism in that room, I'd at least like to think that he might have said, really, tell me about it. Or if I had said there was some racism. When I said there was anti-Semitism, it was as if I was talking about marching Jews off to concentration camps. It's like there's nothing, or there's concentration camps or shooting Jews. And not having grades of mistreatment makes it hard to then be able to know when something is anti-Semitic or not. So that's the first reason I think it's often confusing. The second is that anti-Semitism is cyclical. It goes from periods when it is overt to periods when it is much more covert. It's still there. An image I've often used in the past is to say that every Jew carries an invisible loose noose that's kind of here. And in some periods and in some countries, we can move our arms and our legs, but everyone knows that that noose could tighten. And I will add that in this last 2 years, the cycle has been shifting, certainly in many parts of the world, including in the United States. But because it's cyclical, it's not often understood. And so, after Pittsburgh, when there were so many articles of, I never thought it would happen here in the United States. I never thought we would see anti-Semitism, is a misunderstanding of anti-Semitism, because it historically goes from periods where it's not to periods where it's more overt. So that's the second reason I think it's often confusing. The third is, I have come to understand in a deeper way through my work that many non-Jews have unconscious, internalized bias recordings that Jews are not oppressed. And to give you an example, in my organization, we often in our training programs give people a chance to caucus on a particular group identity where they've experienced mistreatment or they know their people have. And then they prepare a report of the things they never again want people to say, think, or do towards their group. And there might be a Black African Heritage Caucus and a Latino and an Asian caucus and a Native Indigenous and an LGBTQ caucus and a women's caucus, etc. And there's often a Jewish caucus. When the Jews give their report of the things they never again want people to say, think, and do about their group, and then after all the reports are given, and we'll turn to the group and say, what was something from one report that touched you, that moved you, or was new information? For an NCBI is 33 years old, so I've been doing this work for a while. Rarely do people without a lot of training about anti-Semitism, rarely has someone mentioned the Jewish Caucus report as something that touched them or moved them or gave them new information. And when this first started happening, I was really baffled. And I would think to myself, well, maybe they're not giving a powerful enough report. And I would listen to the report. And they would say things like, the Jews would say things like, we never again want to be killed. We never again want to have gas chambers. We never again want to have police at our synagogues. And I thought, no, they're fine. That basically and I had to face, after having this happen probably 100 times, that there had to be unconscious bias internalized, that Jews are not oppressed. So I think that impacts being able to take the issue on. The next point is there's no Gentile allies movement. There is Christian Jewish work or Muslim Jewish work or Christian Muslim Jewish work, and that is powerful, important work. But that's different than an allies movement. So for example, there's Men Against Rape, there's white privilege conferences around racism, there's PFLAG, Parents and Family of Lesbian and Gays. There are ally groups on other oppression issues that the group is specifically designed as an ally group, but there has not been. I should add that I have recently launched a project called Jews and Allies United to End Anti-Semitism in 19 cities, because I am committed to there being an allies movement, but there hasn't been one. The next point, and I'm going to the last point, and I'll come back to number E on the slide, is that so much is now done in code words. And I don't know about you, but when they first started using the word globalist or elitist, and sometimes I had to look up, there constantly are these new words. When the head of the NRA spoke about the Parkland High School shootings, which 40% of the young people at Parkland are Jewish, and use the term globalists and elitists as code words for Jews. So there's been a whole sense of these code words that also has made it difficult. And the last one I'll say about why it's so confusing, and Lindsay, you can put the slide now for the Airbnb ad. This was an ad that was in the Washington Post, and I'm sure many of you know that Airbnb had made a decision to not have Airbnb properties on settlements on the West Bank. Without getting into, was that a good thing or a bad thing? And there may be a diversity of opinion on this call, but they did not decide to not have Airbnbs throughout Israel. There are still, hundreds of Airbnbs all throughout Israel. And this ad says, boycotting Israel is anti-Semitic. And they weren't boycotting Israel. So there's often a lot of what I call false accusations of anti-Semitism that also make it difficult. So all of those things, there's no grades of mistreatment. Anti-Semitism is cyclical. Many Gentiles have internalized messages that Jews are not oppressed. There's no active allies movement. There are code words used, and there's sometimes false cries of anti-Semitism. All of that has made it a little challenging for us as well as our allies. So with that, the next piece I want to talk about, and Lindsay, you can move me to the next slide. Thank you. Is I was leading workshop after workshop and I would do a session on anti-Semitism, and half the time people would not know if something was anti-Semitic or not. Sometimes in these workshops, I would actually have someone share a story of a time they've experienced anti-Semitism and have the group vote. Was it anti-Semitic or was it not? And these were smart, progressive activists, and they didn't always know. So out of that experience of having that happen over and over again, I decided that as a help to all of us, I would try to put forward a simple 3 criteria explanation of when something is anti-Semitic or not. And you don't have to have all 3 of the components. So the first is, are Jews or Israel being singled out for blame? And not blamed, but singled out as the problem. Because that is our history of oppressed peoples being taught that the problem is Jews. So they don't then get to face and fight what the real oppression is. And I'll give 3 examples. So the first was, I and maybe some of you on this call were at the UN Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa in August of 2001. On the one hand, Durban was an amazing place to be. 20,000 anti-racism activists from all over the world. It was like my people. As a Jew, Durban was a very painful place to be. People were wearing buttons saying Hitler didn't do enough of his job. I spent the whole week working with the Jewish community around what was happening in Durban. At the NGO, the National Government Organization Conference, which is the conference I attended, in the NGO UN documents, Israel was the only country in the world mentioned for racism. I personally think that what is going on towards the Palestinians absolutely has racism in it. Is Israel the only racist country? Absolutely not. As a USer, we are standing on stolen lands, slavery, and just to name the US, not any other country. So the singling out for blame is it was the only country mentioned. The second is, our friend and ally, George Soros, and someone wrote recently that he's an awful busy man. He single-handedly was responsible for the caravan. he was single-handedly responsible for the attacks on Kavanaugh, not to mention all the things he's been attacked for in Hungary. And so that in that situation, it's an individual being singled out as the problem. And the third example was at City College of New York, and I think it's been now a couple years that the Board of Governors of the college had made a decision that they were going to reduce by $500 million the amount of money for City College. The reason they gave for reducing $500 million for City College was that there was some anti-Semitism on campus. And a professor who is Jewish and whose husband, who is also Jewish, who's taught at City College of New York for 20 years, wrote afterwards, "I've been with my husband for 20 years. He's been teaching there at City College. He has never once mentioned anti-Semitism." The issue is not, might there have been some incidents of anti-Semitism? The issue is that that was the single reason given for pulling out $500 million from public education. So rather than saying, we don't want to support public education anymore, when a young person without a lot of means realizes that their tuition and books and rates are going significantly up, the reason they're given is because of Jews. So the UN conference, George Soros, City College are examples of Jews, or in the case of the UN documents, Israel, being singled out for blame. So Lindsay, next one, thank you. So the second, so that's the first example, singled out for blame. The next one is, and this is really important to me to understand for all the things we are battling and that is going on in this current period. The way I like to talk about it is that the mechanism of anti-Semitism is to separate Jews out from other oppressed groups and by derailing the efforts of liberation movements. And again, if we think historically, if you can imagine oppressed peoples kind of marching forward to take on and challenge their oppression, and there's this literally this divert sign that says, that way, blame the Jews. And by getting diverted, they don't ever have to get unified and take on their oppression. So anytime a liberation movement gets diverted, and in the recent period, it's by cause of anti-Semitism, that mechanism is anti-Semitism. The derailing efforts, which is why, to me, it's so important that we learn how to stay in coalition and teach our partners what anti-Semitism is, so that we can stop this derailing of movements by anti-Semitic issues constantly being put forward. So, and I'll give you 3 examples. So the first is the Black Lives Matter. The first is the Black Lives Matter platform. And if you haven't read it, you really should. It's very powerful and profound. In it, again, there's one international issue that's mentioned, and it was Israel. And there were 2 particular lines. It talked about what was being done to Palestinians as genocide and that Israel was an apartheid state. And the issue for me is, again, not to get into, and this is the challenging piece, not to get into back and forth debates. Is what's happening in Israel right now apartheid? Is there genocide? And by the way, that it was written by a Jewish woman, that page. The primary issue around how anti-Semitism functions is that the week that the Black Lives Matter platform came out, and actually for several weeks, rather than being able to celebrate the work of the platform, there was back and forth between Black Lives Matter activists and some Jews. And, you know, was this anti-Semitism and this is horrible and why are we it was, again, an example of the first point, being singled out for blame, and it diverting a very important liberation effort. And again, this is not a coincidence, and my third example is the Women's March. It is not a coincidence. It isn't just that it happens to be that someone wrote that statement in Black Lives Matter. It's that is the mechanism of how anti-Semitism works. Oh, I actually was going to do Creating Change Conference second. Creating Change Conference, which is a very important conference around gay and lesbian issues, and A Greater Bridge, which is an organization that backs LGBTQ work in Israel. And they were first invited to the conference. Then some people voiced concern that they shouldn't be at the conference because Israel's so horrible. Then they were uninvited. Then a bunch of progressive Jews went and said, you know, that's not okay. You really need to re-invite them. It's not okay to single out Israel. So they were re-invited, and there was all kinds of mistreatment. The police had to get called. And again, it derailed the conference. And I will say that the leadership, you know, I spoke a lot with them afterwards, and they did some training on anti-Semitism. And actually the LGBTQ community has been, that in the women's community, with Letty's article in 1953, the women's movement community and the LGBTQ community have been the first two communities to make any kind of commitment to take on anti-Semitism. And then the third is the Women's March. And again, we have a diversity of opinion. I know some of you on this call, I am marching on Saturday in DC. Some of you are marching either in DC or in your local community. Some of you have decided not to. And the point, again, isn't, are you right to march? Are you wrong to march? It's that having that issue emerge in such public news media, dividing the women's movement way, is the classic way that anti-Semitism emerges. And my commitment is that we begin to teach our coalition partners not all the details of anti-Semitism, but how it functions to derail our movements, because this is historic. We are just seeing now in Black Lives Matter, Creating Change, the Women's March, that's Black liberation, gay liberation, women's liberation. It's also true in England, in the Labour Party. I have friends who've been working with the Labour Party around anti-Semitism, around all the issues that have emerged around Jeremy Corbyn. So that's the labor movement. That it is not a coincidence that that is the issue that comes forward and pits groups. So that's the second criteria, is that when you see a liberation movement being derailed or all kinds of upset, dividing and disunifying folks, that is the mechanism of anti-Semitism. And the third, are Jews or Israel being isolated from the rest of the world? The core of Jewish oppression is isolating Jews, historically putting Jews in ghettos. And again, different oppressions are different. The core of racism and slavery was ripping Black African heritage families apart in order to perpetrate racism. Jewish oppression is based on ghettoizing Jews, forcing them to only be in enclaves with each other. So anytime that Jews are getting isolated out from other groups, that is a component of anti-Semitism. So I've been on lots of college campuses, kind of pre and post, with BDS resolutions and working with Jewish students and all students on campuses around the issues of anti-Semitism. And on some campuses, there are coalitions that have nothing to do with, that could be on the environment, where Jewish students are asked their positions on Israel in order to join the coalition. No other group is asked that. So that, in effect, is isolating Jews out from other peoples. And to give you a second example, my husband is a civil rights attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, a very unhappy place to be at the moment, I might add. And a couple of years ago, he had a case in Northern California, and it was a battered women's shelter that they made to work at a battered women's shelter. Everyone had to sign a statement that they agreed that Zionism is racism. And if they didn't sign that statement, they couldn't work at the battered women's shelter. And he basically got that deemed illegal. But those examples are of isolating Jews out. So those are the three criteria: singled out for blame, derailing a liberation movement, or isolating Jews and or Israel from the rest of the world's peoples. So the last piece of the kind of my talking presentation is what I call the hook. And excuse this drawing, my office helped me put this together, and it was the best we could do from the internet for this webinar. I want to kind of give a little background. I've been leading weekends for young and young adult Jews who do social justice work, and I started doing that about 5 years ago when I was finding that so many of them who were doing all this anti-racism work didn't understand themselves as Jews and how they were showing up as Jews in anti-racism work. So I began to lead these weekends for young and young adult Jews on anti-Semitism, internalized anti-Semitism, the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism. And I developed this hook to be helpful in how we as Jews show up in coalition and what I call this hook. So I will try to describe what's in this diagram. So the first is, in the middle of it is, and that's as close as we got to flames. So it's what I call the flames of anti-Semitism. And I want to say 2,000 years of hatred. And I want to say a quick little aside about that 2,000 years of hatred. I was at a workshop that a Black African Heritage Gentile buddy of mine who does a lot of anti-racism work, and she was leading the workshop. And she was trying to help people, I think, to reassure us that we could end racism at least in some of our lifetimes. And the way she did that was she started out saying, well, she said, racism is relatively recent. And then she proceeded to say, unlike the longest hatred, and I knew she meant anti-Semitism. And after she said that, it had this profound impact on me of really wanting to face that what it means to be a people that has had 2,000 years of this history. So, okay, so that's the flames of anti-Semitism. Now, and for this hook, I am specifically speaking in particular to those of us who are white Ashkenazi. I've had Mizrahi Jews and Sephardi Jews and Jews of color, Jews from racialized groups, say it completely relates to them and others not. So I want to be clear that this is in particular for white Ashkenazi Jews with people of color, whether they are Jews or Gentiles. Okay, so the flame of anti-Semitism, to the arrow on top, leads us to have certain scars of fear, anxiety, worry, fears for our security and survival. I like to say we come by it honestly. And the phrase I often use is that we Jews are scared active. And by that, I mean that when we're scared, we take action. There are some folks, some white Gentiles, when they're scared, they'll hide out in their bedroom. I like to say when we Jews are scared, we build 10 new organizations. So fear propels us to action. And with that comes certain behaviors. And again, I say this with deep love for myself and all who are on the call who are Jews, with deep love for our people. This comes out of a history of anti-Semitism. But some of those behaviors include, sometimes we interrupt, sometimes we want to take charge of things or even take over. Out of when we get anxious and worried, are things going to be okay? And that scared active behavior comes out of trying to basically have a sense of security. Now, we may do that across the board. We do it with each other. as Jews. When that behavior, going around the circle, when we do that behaviors, if we interrupt people, we try to take charge of things, we may even take over. And I lead a lot of trainings in my organization with a Black Gentile woman. We've been training together for 28 years. And I still, sometimes, when I get excited about things, I interrupt her. And I watch, she goes blank and she loses her thought. So when we do those behaviors towards people from racialized groups, people of color, some folks have used the term global majority, it's racism. It's not our fault, but it is racism. Then, and going around the cycle to the left side, is what comes at us. We sometimes get hated, creamed, abandoned, because we're often scared active. We're often way more than our percentage. We are 0.02% of the world's population, 2% of the US population. We are way more in every social justice activity. Our traditions bring us to it, traditions of Tikkun Olam, and so we're out there and with that anxiety showing. And so we often get singled out for blame, targeting, abandonment, and that's anti-Semitism. And that adds then to the flame and the cycle continues. And the reason it's so important to me to teach this is because some folks just look at Jews and say, you're being racist. Other folks look and say, we're being targeted, abandoned, and hated. And the truth is, it's the whole cycle. We have to interrupt the whole cycle, which is both pieces. And the last piece I'll say is that both pieces are anti-Semitism. It's not one piece or the other. It is both the scared, active, and the being singled out for blame, attacked, abandoned. That is the anti-Semitism. And in my experience of teaching both white Ashkenazi Jews and people of color, both Jews and Gentiles, this hook, we can have much deeper compassion for ourselves, and our allies can have much deeper compassion. And in understanding this also, that we can stop that cycle, both of the behaviors that are racist and the abandonment of Jews. So I'm going to stop there. And Ari, we're going to take some time for questions.
Yeah, so if folks want to actually drop in their questions to the chat box and then we can answer them. I had one question come in during around clarification over like the second point or the second indicator of like anti-Semitism, and the question was—
That's the one about derailing efforts in liberation movements?
I think it's about
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's the second one. Yep.
Yeah, actually, do you want to ask the question? Dennis?
No, but if you can just.
Okay, so, and clarify if I don't get it right. Is anti-Semitism, so the question was, is the anti-Semitism the action of organizers of the Women's March, and the test that it's anti-Semitic is that it leads to division, or does it make Jews a scapegoat for division, and so that is the anti-Semitism, not the original?
That's a great question. I think it's both. It can function in both ways. I mean, it is clearly that the overemphasis, and again, I want to be clear, that there is no way that there isn't going to have anti-Semitism by Gentiles organizing something that shows, just as there's no way for those of us that are white participating in these events that we're not going to perpetrate racism. And I know that for many, because I've been listening a lot in these last few weeks, and I'm sure many of you have as well, to our Jewish sisters of color, and where they feel the anti-Semitism and the racism, and they're being asked to pick one over the other around the march. But that I think it's both. It is both that it derails the effort of the march. So, and the right is walking away being thrilled. The right is thrilled that the Women's March has been so divided. And it is also that people can say the reason it got so divided is because these Jews are complaining about this issue. It can function in both ways. I haven't, and they may be out there, I haven't read as much yet. And I say yet, because I'm sure it's out there, and maybe some of you have read it, and I'd love to see. I haven't yet read a whole lot of it's the fault of Jews that we're being divided, but I'm sure it's out there and will come. So it's both. I don't think it's an either or.
Okay, thank you. Great, and I know we have a question. I'm trying to scroll. I'm losing track of all the comments. I think Robin Leeds of our board actually had a question, so I want to give her an opportunity to ask her question quick.
I'm sorry, who's the question from?
It's from Robin Leeds. Are you able to unmute? We have a group of Nancy with our board members who is joining us.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, so this is the board member?
Yes.
Robin. Hi.
Robin.
Okay.
Can you get the picture off that's there, Lindsay?
That's on our,
It's not us.
Hi, Robin. Oh, is that not right?
I don't know. Hi. So obviously this has been going on forever, especially with the focus on Farrakhan. I remember during the Million Man March,
Yep.
when I was working with an LGBTQ coalition who wanted to march of African American LGBTQ, and in the march, and of course they went through the process and they were summarily rejected and said, absolutely not, you're not going. So that, lots of back and forth similar to the march, lots of issues. And basically the decision of the coalition was, that's okay. This is our march too. And we're marching and we're going to be out and we're going to be loud. And in the end, I think it was a really good thing. I mean, it was a huge contingent.
Right.
People made their own signs. People built relationships with other people who were at the march who may have had some homophobic feelings, but, it was a context where people kind of learn and grow potentially. But instead of taking no for an answer, the answer was, okay, you don't want us, but we want to be there. Okay, this is our movement too. And I just thought that was a really interesting lesson, an example. Yes. And people have referenced also the various St. Patrick's Day parades and all of that.
And absolutely. And I just want to say, I mean, when the Million Man March happened.
Okay. So
I'm sorry. Was there a question?
The question.
Oh, so anyway, I was making a statement before.
Okay. No, go ahead, please.
Jewish. I'm Ashkenazi. I can't help it. So anyway, so what is the parallel with that example to the current day conflicts in the Women's March, and how do we interpret that, and how does that guide our actions going forward?
Okay. No, that's a great example, and it's good because I think not that we Jews ever get a little paranoid that it's really us, and to realize that because certainly with Farrakhan there's it's sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, there's a whole bunches of challenging issues. But I just want to say I remember when the when the Million Man March happened, and it happened to be that weekend. There's an annual workshop of all of the Black African heritage leaders in my organization, and they were meeting, and they invited me to come to speak to them. And so there were about 100 Black African leaders from my organization meeting, and then they were planning to go to the march. And I spoke to them as a Jew, and I just said, I am with you and behind the march, and I want us to learn to take on anti-Semitism so we get to fight this together. And I think, the similar, you asked about the parallel to the Women's March. And again, it's my commitment has been to show up, but also I think, and, I've listened to a few of you on this call, over the last few weeks, that I've heard agree in the principles of the first march 2 years ago, there was no mention of anti-Semitism. And folks, I think, didn't even think it was necessary I mean, I was a little bit kind of out in the wilderness I've been doing workshops on anti-Semitism now for the last 35 years. And it's suddenly this plethora of interest in the issue in these last 2 years since the election. But now anti-Semitism is mentioned. So, and there are several Jewish women that have been invited to be on the steering committee. And Yavila McCoy and April Baskin, so Jewish women of color. And so that issue is now out there up front, and I don't think people can ignore it in the same way. And that's the coalition work, is the issues come up and we need to stay with each other. So I think it's a good example, but the example is, it's not just marching to say this is my movement too. It's marching saying this is my movement too, and I'm going to be here to keep having those hard conversations about anti-Semitism and the intersections of anti-Semitism and racism. Because I also want to say, it's not a coincidence that it keeps being the Black leaders who get shown up for their anti-Semitism. And, I live in DC, so, the comment about, by a Black city council that that the Rothschilds were responsible for bad weather. And our mayor did a major session on anti-Semitism, and I keynoted it. And we led all these workshops. So it's both that it rises up the issues, which is great, and there's also certain groups that get singled out for their anti-Semitism, so that Black people and Jews and white Jews and Black people get pitted against each other systematically, which is also, I'm so passionately committed to taking a stand against that.
We have
okay, Ari, another question.
Yep, we have 2 that came in that are pretty similar.
Okay.
It is maybe sometimes difficult to separate issues of Jewish people and the current state of Israel's policies. How do you help make that distinction? And then the follow-up, how do you deal with people attacking you for the actions of Israel simply because you are Jewish and not Israeli?
Right. Okay, so let me unpack, because there's a couple different pieces there. So let me say a couple things. I will just say, personally, I've been involved in helping to build peace groups, Jewish peace groups in the US since 1967. So I've been passionately committed to trying to figure out how we can stay deeply, deeply proud of Israel and also take on the issues around Palestinian rights and liberation. And so there's 2 pieces. There is both, there's every time any Jewish person wants to say anything critical of the policies of the Israeli government, some factors of our community call them self-hating Jews. Or that they are, Jews perpetrating anti-Semitism. And I think it's a big mistake to say that anytime there is any criticism of the Israeli government, that has to be anti-Semitism. The things we're looking for are the 3, it's like, again, is Israel being singled out as the only problem in the conflict? And when that happens, there is elements of anti-Semitism. Again, it may not be the only thing it isn't like this is anti-Semitic, so then nothing else matters in what's being said. So that when there are ways of fighting against policies that people don't like of the Israeli government that single out Israel as the only country to blame, that has anti-Semitism in it. The trick is, it doesn't necessarily mean that you throw the whole thing out. It doesn't mean that every criticism is wrong or that every criticism is anti-Semitic. But if the overall organizing movement, organization effort is singling out Israel, then there is anti-Semitism in it, in my understanding. And then the last, you also said something about someone just because they're Jewish, which is some of what I was saying on college campuses. I mean, there was a student at UCLA who was running for city council, and she wasn't even involved in Israel organizing or anything, but they knew she was Jewish, and somebody questioned whether she could have good judgment on the city government at UCLA because she was a Jew. Now that's clearly anti-Semitism. So if someone is simply because of the fact that they're a Jew, then that's anti-Semitism.
I have another question here, or actually I think Nancy had a question that she wanted to ask. So I want to give her.
Okay, and all right, what I'm going to say is I think maybe we can do like up to 5 more minutes, and then I'm going to do the teaching piece of the skill, and then we'll have time for more questions, I think, as well.
Hi, Sherry. Thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, Nancy.
Sherry's been a wonderful resource for us during this whole difficulty and challenging times that we're living through.
And I have to say, I've been very moved by Nancy. So,
Thank you.
No, I have. I just want you. I just think you've really fought hard on some very, very difficult issues.
Appreciate that. I think what I'd love you to speak a little bit to, and we have about 150 people on this call from all over the country who have really been struggling and really deeply concerned about the Women's March. So, I want, if you could speak a little bit, because you've been at this a long time, the sort of differentiation between the left and the right, anti-Semitism,
Yes.
on the left and the right, the issue of white nationalism and anti-Semitism
Yes.
versus, the left, both in terms of Israel and in terms of the Women's March. Because I think there's confusion, there's concern, there's anger, but I think there's a dynamic going on and a need for more understanding and information about, what's really happening and this issue. And I'd like to go back to the issue of staying in the room and trying to engage versus leaving the room, because we have struggled.
Okay, I understand. All right, so let me say something about the right and the left, and then the other piece that you said. And then I think after I answered that, let me do the skill set, and then we'll have time for more questions. So first, around the anti-Semitism, the right and the left. And I mean, there's different components of anti-Semitism on the right. I mean, there is the white supremacy movement, which we are seeing more and more of, and Eric Ward's important work on anti-Semitism in the white supremacy movement, and who's an African American man, and that we've certainly seen it's been there, but it was more covert, and there's been a lot more permission for it to stay more visible now. Is the anti-Semitism and the white supremacy movement. But I also want to talk for a minute about another component of anti-Semitism on the right. And there was a book that was written, and it was 1984, and it was called The Real Anti-Semitism in America by the head of ADL. And I disagreed with many of the components, and I met with him. And actually, I liked him a lot. And he met with me because he wanted to meet with a progressive Jew that he wanted to connect with. And there was a famous line in that book. And he said, and this was in terms of the Christian right. And he said, when the Messiah comes, we'll decide whose side we're on. And again, the understanding around that is that, that Christian evangelicals believe that in order for the Messiah to come again, a certain number of Jews have to convert. And so he said, when the Messiah comes again, we'll decide whose side we're on. In the meantime, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. And he also said in that book, The Real Anti-Semitism in America, that the Christian right was now our friends and the Black African heritage community was not. And I say that because that was an analysis, and this was 1984, but the seeds of that are still with us in terms, because that has everything to do with coalition building. Who do you partner with? And, as a progressive, someone deeply committed to the women's movement, someone deeply committed to Black liberation, women's liberation, gay liberation, that we get to decide who we partner with. But if we have a basic commitment to the unity principles of that coalition, then I think it should be our commitment to stay. And a lot of the work on taking on anti-Semitism and racism needs to be one-on-one relationship building. I believe deeply that the core, I mean, I'm an organizer, and the core of organizing is one-on-one relationship building. And so it's not about putting out a set of 20 principles of anti-Semitism that people need to take on. It's in those relationships that we get to, and we should, I mean, it's better if we have the relationships first. When the Black Lives Matter platform came out, there wasn't the same amount of relationships, and that impacted what could happen immediately afterwards. And so part of what we need, I mean, prevention work is to get those relationships built, to know there's going to be anti-Semitism. There is going to be racism. That's the nature. And our groups get systematically pitted against each other by these isms. And to go out and build the relationships that are personal and that we can then sit in a room and have heart-to-heart, really difficult conversations, one-on-one or two and two, but in small groups, and teach each other. You know, and teach each other what causes. I'm going to share a quick story. And then I want to move to the skill training piece, and then we'll have time for more questions. This was a college campus a bunch of years ago, and Kwame Ture, who used to be Stokely Carmichael, was on the campus, was alleged to have said the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. A Jewish student stood up and said, I'm a Zionist, and he got slugged. And it was on the 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock news, and the campus was really worried. And they invited me and my organization, and I got to campus, and ABC and CBS and NBC camera crews were all lined up. I mean, the media does not always do a great job for us around these issues. And I let them stay to hear why the students and faculty came, and then they left. And we had Black and Jewish students and faculty in the room. And at one point, and we did, it's a process we teach in my organization called the controversial issue process, where the group chooses a divisive issue they don't agree on. And so they chose, should people who perpetrate hate speech in their message be welcomed on campus? It's a very critical issue right now on campuses. And they were divided. And so the Black student goes first, and he says, don't tell us who to listen to. That's racist. Do you think we're stupid? Do you think we can't listen to someone's message and decide in it what's hateful and what's not? Stop insulting us. And he was speaking as an African-American student about feeling like being told who he could and couldn't listen to was racism. The Jewish student went next and said, don't tell us to just trust you. Our whole history is one of being told everything is okay until it's too late. We need to see more proof to trust. We can't just trust you. And after we got those two pieces out, I sent them back to say, so how can the Black students and faculty have self-determination while the Jewish students and faculty can build trust and know that they aren't going to get abandoned? Which is, how do we take on racism and anti-Semitism? And I sent them off to come up with a solution. They decided to privately, away from the media, each invite a controversial speaker and go together as a coalition and teach each other what in the message was powerful to them, that meant something, and what was hateful. And that Black Jewish coalition lasted for a decade. And it was very powerful. So those relationships have to be deeply in place. And if they're not in place when things hit, then they have to be built. So I want to go to this teaching piece, this last teaching piece, and then there will be time for more questions. So this is a skill that I want to teach. And Lindsay, you can move it to skills for shifting attitudes. So I just move, that's it, okay. So this is a skill that we teach in my organization, because in my experience, when people, and the reason I want to teach this skill on the webinar is because, again, I want to give us the muscle to learn in the face of when we hear anti-Semitism, how we take it on. And so this is a skill set. And I'm first going to demonstrate, and there are 3 NCJW folks that volunteered to help me. And so the first is going to be Jill Lexier, and Jill's from Chicago. So Jill, are you there?
Yes.
Great. So I'm just going to say a few things, Jill, and then we'll go to. So what I'm going to be demonstrating is, in my organization, we call this the bug. And we call it the bug because Jill is going to make an anti-Semitic comment 3 times. The first 2 times, I'm going to demonstrate what's not helpful, because I think it helps to see that. And then on the 3rd round, I'm going to demonstrate the skill I want to teach. I'll review some of the things embedded in that skill, and then 2 other NCJW folks are going to practice with other anti-Semitic comments. And then we'll have time for more questions. Okay, Jill.
Jews, they own everything in this neighborhood.
Hey, Jill, you know, we had this big snowstorm here in DC, you know, a couple days ago. Did you get snow in Chicago?
Sherry, I'm not talking about the weather. You didn't hear what I said. I said Jews own everything in this neighborhood.
So that's the first response that's not helpful. I ignored her. I changed the subject. I diverted the conversation to something else. And that's often, I mean, again, that's a little bit like the going silent piece I said in the beginning. We either go silent, we say nothing, we divert attention, we ignore the comment, and that doesn't move anything. So that's what I call the bad response, is ignoring the comment or diverting their attention, which is not useful. Here's the second response that's not useful.
Jews, they own everything in this neighborhood.
I can't believe you said that, Jill. That is really stupid. I mean, maybe you haven't lived in this neighborhood very long, but that is really a stupid anti-Semitic comment.
Oh, you're calling me stupid now?
So that is what I call the ugly response. Not useful. And in both, when I changed the subject in the first time with Jill, she got more defensive. And in the second time, clearly calling her stupid, she got increasingly more defensive. It was not useful. And there's what I call the white middle class version of that, which is that really offends me. And again, that is not a particularly useful response. So now Jill's going to make the comment one last time, and I'm going to introduce the skill set that I want to teach.
Jews, they own everything in this neighborhood.
Wow, Jill, I'm really glad you're bringing that to me. You sound really concerned. Has something specific happened?
Yeah, my cousin tried to rent a place from a Jew landlord and he wouldn't rent it to her.
Wow, that must have been really, really rough on your cousin. I'd love to listen to you and hear more about what happened. So in that 3rd time, when I changed the subject and ignored Jill's concern, I did not hear what was going on for her. When I attacked her, I did not hear what was going on for her. In this 3rd example, and the very specific phrasing of the words I use.
Call's still going on, but I can. Okay.
In
So,
this,
did you find something else? I just put in whatever, and I figured I would just change it. Okay.
Whoever just talked, you should mute yourself. In the 3rd example with Jill, when I asked her, did something specific, because one of the things often when someone says something, it's a global, but there's usually a story underneath. One of the phrases in my organization we use is, we don't change people's minds, we change their hearts. And what changes hearts are hearing stories, particularly when those stories are personal and emotional. So I'm going to go through what the skills are embedded in what I was just trying to model. Then I have 2 other NCJW folks that are going to practice doing that skill as well. So the first thing in the 3rd round, in what I'm calling the good response that I just did with Jill, was using an effective caring tone. Obviously, an attacking tone is not going to shift anything. The second is what decreases defensiveness. If you increase defensiveness, you just have a wall, and there is no place for something new to happen. So using a caring tone, asking a question to decrease defensiveness. And the third is the way I like to talk about this is we can't, and this is really key to all the things I've been saying and work on the march or anything else. We can't have two ouches at the same moment. And what that means is, if you've had the experience, which I know all of us have, you go to someone and say, what you did really upset me. And they say, well, let me tell you what you just did. Or if we go and say, that was really anti-Semitism, let me tell you about your racism. You can't have two ouches at the same moment. The other image I often give is if you had a pain in your leg and you went to a doctor and said, let me tell you about the pain in my leg. And the doctor said, yeah, let me tell you about the pain in my arm. You wouldn't stay very long with that doctor. So somebody has to decide temporarily to put their ouch in the parking lot. Now, as long as you remember where your car is, if you put it in the parking lot, you can get it again. It doesn't mean that you don't ever get to say what's going on for you. But when someone makes a bigoted comment, usually there is an ouch underneath. And what most of us try, so if the bigoted comment is up here, most of us just focus on, I'm going to tell you why that's wrong. Rather than getting to what is the ouch underneath, there's no chance for that comment to shift. The other piece is that if someone is making an anti-Semitic comment, it often means their cup is full. And when a cup is full, you can't put more liquid in, which means there's not a place for new information. We would like to give new information, but if someone's cup is full, you have to empty the cup first. So in this process, it's really trying to, so the skill is using a caring tone, asking questions, and the kind of question we want is to try to get a story. Someone's personal experience, because when someone gets listened to, then they have more space to listen to us. To temporarily put our ouch in the parking lot, to try to drain the cup. And also, I wrote as the last piece, there is a role for information. And how do you know if you've given it too quickly? It's if that person gets defensive again, they haven't been listened to enough. And these skills are key for being able to keep a good relationship while trying to take on the anti-Semitism. So I'm going to do 2 more demonstrations, and then we will have, time for additional questions, before we have to close. So Hannah Cotton-Smith, who is new, I should say, to the national office, has agreed to do the second one. So Hannah, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, yep, I can hear you. So in this one, I'm going to make the comment now, but we're going to do this also in 2 parts because there's an additional skill piece I want to teach, which is when someone makes or does something anti-Semitic, we have feelings about it. And it's understandable. When we have a lot of feelings, that means our cup is full. We are not the best person in that moment to help listen to them and use the skills I've just taught until our cup has been emptied a bit. So, and I like to call this having a venting buddy. Hopefully most of you on this call have venting buddies. You have someone at work or in your life, you get to go, do you know what that idiot just said? And then you can try to go handle it. So with Hannah, I'm going to make an anti-Semitic comment, a different one. And first, I'm going to ask Hannah to vent, to say the least polite thing, not what she'd ever say or what I'm at least coaching her to say to that person, but so she gets a chance to vent, because I really want to model that if our cup is full and we are so upset with what we've heard or witnessed, we are not the best person to take it on until our cup has been emptied a bit. So we need to vent away from the person that's made the oppressive comment. Hannah, you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. Hannah, Jews, they are so smart.
Wow, Sherry, that is disgusting. That is so anti-Semitic. You're really contributing to the terrible anti-Semitism problem in this country. You really are the problem, Sherry. Like, that is just disgusting. I don't even know what to say to you.
All right. So, and again, that is not what I'm recommending that Hannah would say to the person, because I don't think that would move things very much, and it certainly wouldn't keep a good relationship. But she needs some place to scream that out to someone. So now, Hannah, we're going to practice the skills I was demonstrating of tone, asking a question to decrease defensiveness, putting your ouch in the parking lot, trying to listen and drain my cup. So let's try it again. You ready?
Yes.
So Jews, they are all so smart.
Oh, okay, Sherry. It's interesting you say that. Can you tell me why you think all Jewish people are smart? Like, what experiences you've had that have brought you to that conclusion?
And that's one great response. And what I'm gonna coach you to do it again, and because we're trying to get at a story more. So when I say it the second time, Hannah, let's try something like, you know, wow, you sound really concerned. I'd love to hear more. You want it to be just as general as possible. Okay. So let's try it one more time. Jews, they are so smart.
Oh, Sherry, that's interesting. It seems like you have a concern. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, well, I have these two, they're always acting so smart. I mean, I don't think I could ever, ever, ever compete with anything I've watched Jews do, etc. Mm-hmm. So the key is it was the open-ended. When in the first time you did it, I was less likely to tell you that story. And again, it's like having a caring tone. It's like you want to get to what's underneath, but you need to have that shift in tone. So that was great. Thank you, Hannah, so much.
Thank you.
And we have one more person that's agreed to demonstrate. And so Susie Greenman, who's from Dallas, NCJW. Susie, are you there? Is Susie there? Let me just wait a second to see if she's muted. Ari, can you see if Susie's on the call?
So we have one or two Susies here. Let me try muting and unmuting.
Okay, it's Susie Greenman from Dallas.
Mm-hmm. But we do have, there's a handful of Susies.
It's S-U-Z-I, if that makes a difference. Are they all spelled that way?
So we do, I'm wondering if it's not connecting or
well, try for another second, and if not, I'll just say what it was going to be. All right, well, I don't think we should. Okay, so the last example was going to be someone saying, you know, there is no real anti-Semitism. You know, there's been so much publicity about anti-Semitism, but I don't think anti-Semitism is a big deal right now at all. And so I'll just say, similarly to the other two demonstrations, that the key would be to be able, again, when someone says something like that, they're trying to say something. Often they are upset about something. And the key skill set is, if we don't create the conditions to listen. I always like to say, listening is the most profound, revolutionary tool that we have to shift people. And I'll just end this part by saying that this is all connected to wanting to stay in coalition, that we are going to have to be able to learn how to practice these skills once the cup is drained. And people are always saying, well, when do I get to say what the anti-Semitism looks like? And you do. And some of the ways, after you've listened to what, then you've created the conditions for someone to actually hear you. And, you know, you get to say something like, I'd love to share what you just said is like for me. Is this a good moment? I find that often asking agreement for someone to listen to you sets up the conditions for them to be able to hear you much more effectively. So let me stop there, Ari, and I think we have a little bit of time for a last round of questions.
And we do have a few questions. And if people, just a reminder, the chat box that might be like popping up or blinking, if you have questions, if you want to go ahead and drop your questions in there, we can make sure to get to everyone. So we had one question that you touched on a little bit. It was, once you've like parked the issue of anti-Semitism at one point, or once you've like kind of parked the issue of anti-Semitism at what point can you finally unpack it? There never seems to really be a right time to unpack it in light of like, police brutality and other things going on in our society. Right. So like, when do we talk about?
Okay, so let me say a couple things. One thing that the question actually brings to mind, this was at one of the trainings that I did, I think maybe about a year and a half ago, with a group of, it was over 50 young adult in their 20s and 30s Jewish activists, social justice activists. And I asked them, how many of you have ever taken on racism, said something, did something, interrupted it in some way? Every single one of the 50 in the room put up their hands. Then I said, and again, this was a year and a half ago, so it was a little before the most recent issues, but there's been a lot of anti-Semitism out there. And then I said, how many of you have ever taken on anti-Semitism, interrupted it, challenged it, told someone they were anti-Semitic? Not one hand in the room went up. And I think this is really significant. And so part of what I think is really key in this, before we even, I will say something about the, when you do the listening part and when do you get to have your turn. But the thing I want to say first is we have to decide and internalize as Jews that we have a right to our struggle. That we have a right to our struggle, that we have a right to have a voice, that our issues matter. And part for me of why the theory piece that I was presenting about how anti-Semitism derails liberation movements is so key is because in my experience, that has given many Jews, as well as our allies, the confidence to realize that anti-Semitism is so important. And I've often talked about it as the opening wedge, meaning, the famous, first they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the gays, etc. And by the Jews, by the time they came for me, nobody was left. Anti-Semitism is often one of the opening wedges, so that it isn't about, is anti-Semitism worse than racism? I mean, racism is horrible and vicious and awful. It's that it plays a particular function that at the UN Conference on Racism in Durban, the work on racism couldn't get done because the issue of anti-Semitism was so out there, confusing everyone. So that it is, and I think that is one of the deepest, most important things is, as Jews, we get to know that it is important, significant. It impacts all the liberation work we care about. So it's important to find our voice. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is, when you said, when you put your ouch in the parking lot, then how do you know? Again, this is relationship building. After you've listened to someone, and it could be just a couple minutes. It depends. I mean, we don't necessarily, I often like to say it's not how long we want it to take, it's how long it takes. You don't know with any given person how embedded they are in the particular things they're saying. But that the skill, in my experience, sometimes even just a couple minutes of caring, thoughtful, listening to what is the ouch underneath, then we can say, we're in partnership together. This relationship matters to me. I'd love to share with you how anti-Semitism is impacting me, because I want this partnership here.
Thanks. So we have another question, and it says, in the anti-racism work I've had, there is a strong message that we shouldn't ask people of color to help us address our racism. Here, we are the total facilitators and activists. Is there any other model where we send them off to do their own work?
Wait, I'm not sure. I heard the part about in race, we're saying that people of color shouldn't be the ones to educate us. I'm just trying to understand, is the question, therefore, why are we the ones taking the lead around anti-Semitism? I'm just trying to understand, is that the question?
I think from who posted this, feel free to jump in. The way that I interpreted it was both like, yes, like in this model that you're presenting, we are the ones who are doing a lot of like the education.
Yeah.
And the question is like, is there another model in which like you send someone off?
Right.
Yeah,
That's a great question.
Because I was struck by the first thing that Jews are activists, and all the anti-racism training I've had, it's like we have a white caucus and a black caucus because black people shouldn't have to perform for you when you're dealing with your racism. And like that's the model. I'm in North Carolina. That's
I hear you.
So I'm just like, wait, here I am. Like,
where am I in this?
Well, yeah, and I'm dealing with a lot of not just the coalition stuff, but just like blatant anti-Semitism here. So, what's going on in the school system. So, that's just a concern I have. Like, I got to go talk to my son about how to deal with the kid that's saying, why do Jews all have all the wealth in high school? Like, so that's just my question. Are there other models? Like, I don't know.
Okay.
This needs to play into our Jewish activist stuff.
I hear you. Okay, let me say a couple of things. One is, because I talked earlier when I said why things were so confusing, one of the things I put out was that there's no allies movement. And it's why I've launched this project. And there actually are some folks in North Carolina that are part of the project. I can connect you with Jews and Allies United to End Anti-Semitism. But the whole point is, there's a Gentile woman that I have partnered with, and she's been leading workshops for non-Jews, and I lead workshops for Jews, and sometimes we bring them together. And there is absolutely a need to have a Gentile movement that takes a lead. And at the same time, it is just true. We also don't want to go victim and say, well, I'm not telling you anything about anti-Semitism because you have to learn it. The point is, it's like when you are the group that's been oppressed, you know the best. And so it's a two-pronged thing. We have to teach our allies. We do. But the expectation is that there will be an independent allied Gentile movement that takes the lead in taking this on. And that's important in doing this work. And then the other piece, when you said around the things are just seen as white or black, then that's about relationship building and building a connection with someone where you get to say, there's a particular role that happens for us as Jews, and if we just do white and black, and again, I don't know where other Latino, I don't know where other people of racialized groups is in all that model as well, but that we might want to have a white Gentile and a white Jews group. As well, assuming, for the white Ashkenazi Jews, because there's particular things that happen for us that we also want to look at. And that's relationship building. We're going to have to, so again, that goes back to my thing. It's like we either stay silent, or we say, this isn't for me and I have to go. And if we stay silent, it won't change. And if you leave, they're not going to have the understanding that there's a piece for you as a white, as a white Southern Jew in North Carolina. You're not Southern, but in the South. You're in the South. You're in North Carolina. That there's a piece for you that also has to have a voice there. But that's relationship building. That's finding someone either who's leading it or someone connect to be your ally and share that in a caring, thoughtful way, which isn't, I don't say anything because it's only white, black, and what can I do? I'm helpless and powerless, and that's just the way it's always going to be. Or I have to leave because this doesn't, they're anti-Semites. They don't understand that we need a voice here. that's that place of staying and reaching for an ally to communicate. All right, what do you think? Maybe time for one more question?
So I think we have 2 more. I know Jody has a question, and then I've got another question, a logistical one.
Jody, here you go.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Sherry, for being with us today. And the timing is really terrific. I'm struck by a lot of what you spoke about, particularly the Movement for Black Lives platform and the Women's March. And I'm curious if you have tips for both our communities and areas and issues and events in which NCJW has grappled and continue to grapple with. And I'm curious if you have tips for us. You alluded to this a little bit, but if you have tips for us sort of after sort of the event happens or the thing happens.
Yeah.
So, you know, what happens when it's all over? How, like, you know, when there isn't necessarily a need to finish the conversation or even continue the conversation.
Right, but that's exactly. I'm so glad we got to this moment that you asked that.
I'm so glad I got to ask it.
Because that's the moment to say that the after is, and I think that's what happens. We then go back into our little world. No, that's the moment to say, now we need to build strong relationships so it sustains, and the next time and the next time that we will have those relationships deeply in place. Because I've seen the history of those relationships being built from, I mean, Durban, there was nothing, you know, and that was 2001. The progressive Jewish world didn't even show up in Durban, you know, for the most part. And Black Lives Matter, they were difficult, but things have been built. Things have been built, you know, amongst women around the Women's March. The key is the march is over. That's just the beginning of saying, now let's really sustain some relationships in the coalition for next times.
I would just add to that, this is Nancy, that it has already put us, because of our role and our role convening the entire Jewish community and our role being a sounding board for our coalition partners, already, as recently as today, the national new president of Planned Parenthood has reached out and said, what can we do afterwards?
Mm-hmm.
Next
Yeah,
Tuesday
great.
with the CEOs of all the women's health organizations who we had actually convened 2 years ago on this, looking to us, and I asked her if she would like discuss this together and how this has impacted on an organization like Planned Parenthood that was so instrumental in the last march and has, you know, some serious questions. What do we do next? How do we convene the mainstream women's movement, the traditional one that's been around for gazillions of years, and why aren't they, you know, where are they? And, you know, we've been keeping them interested and keeping them engaged in the platform. And that has been probably the most painful part of this, is that, you know, we have a platform of issues that are concerned to women, and yet we have a commitment to combating anti-Semitism. And we believe here, and I think our board has felt this very strongly, that we have to do both and not one at the expense of the other. So I just think it's very important for all of you out there and in our wonderful NCJW networks. You are in relationship with people locally, some good, some not good, some good examples. And I know you're navigating this as well, and we're trying to be as helpful as we can to you as we navigate it. It isn't a cookie cutter. It's really, why what you said, Sherry, about organizing. We teach community organizing. We work with Join for Justice because we believe in the one-on-one relationships.
Right.
Yeah, and I know folks are sending in a lot of other questions. Unfortunately, we are not able to get to them. The last thing that Linda asked was, where would we find more information about the Jews and Ally movement that you spoke about?
I'm going to send Ari, there's both a pamphlet that I've written about anti-Semitism, why is it everyone's concern, and it was written by Jews and Allies United to End Anti-Semitism. We're in the process of developing a website. So I'm going to send Ari the information because she's going to send out some follow-up tomorrow, that you can, a link for the pamphlet, and that lists an address around the Jews and Allies United to End Anti-Semitism project. And when the website is up and running, I will make sure that Ari has an announcement to send out that as well.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming, and especially thank you, Sherry, for leading this fantastic webinar, the very timely webinar in skills-based training. Next month, we will also be continuing with our Lead Organizing Skills for Grassroots Advocacy series. We'll be talking about how to have a courageous conversation. So a little bit related, so definitely like be on the lookout for the announcement email for that. That'll be coming out shortly. And thank you so much again for taking the time for our special 90-minute webinar. Expect a follow-up email from us sometime tomorrow afternoon with a recording and other resources of this webinar.
And just thank you again for inviting me to do this, and it was great to be with all of you, through doing this.